The rumble of my Lincoln Town car filled the silence as I turned onto our street, relishing the rare, smooth drive without the usual congestion. The polished walnut dashboard gleamed under the afternoon sun, its pristine condition proof of the hours I'd spent tending to it over the years. A man can't always control the world, but he can at least keep his car spotless. I'm Jake. 38, marketing strategist at Ridgemont Tech. For 8 years, I've kept the gears turning for a company that likes to think it's innovating. They give me a nice office and enough money to live comfortably, plus they don't usually mind when I sneak out early. Today that's exactly what I did, got out a good 15 minutes ahead of schedule and hit the gas toward home. 15 minutes feels like freedom when it's an hour less you'll spend in a tie. Home is my place, shared with my wife, Jenny. Jenny's your typical always-on type, works from home, something in digital marketing, always busy with webinars and client calls. By now, she should be there, likely in the kitchen making her famous healthy dinner, which usually involves ingredients that taste like lawn trimmings. But hey, she keeps us on track, both waistlines and all. As I approached, though, I caught sight of something odd. A yellow cab was just pulling out of the driveway. Jenny rarely used taxis, she had a car after all, and we weren't expecting any guests. I pulled into the drive, watching the cab disappear down the street, the flicker of curiosity settling in the back of my mind. Maybe she'd had a package delivered? A friend over? But even as I let myself in, that creeping feeling was like the subtle hum of an engine running too long. Hey hon, Jenny greeted me from the kitchen, sounding almost startled. She was stirring something in a pot, looking like she hadn't expected me for at least another hour. You're home early. Yeah, I replied, shrugging as I set my briefcase down. Got out a little quicker than usual. You see that taxi outside? Looked like it was pulling out from here. Did we have guests? She gave a casual wave of her spoon, not missing a beat in her stirring. Oh, that? Must have just been turning around in the driveway. These cab drivers don't know where they're going half the time. She let out a small laugh, the kind people give when they're hoping you'll buy whatever they're selling. But as I moved to the living room and flipped on the TV, something didn't sit right. It was tuned to a sports channel, some commentator analyzing a game with the kind of enthusiasm I saved for bourbon. Problem is, I don't watch sports channels. Never have, except the occasional live game with friends. I sure as hell didn't leave it on ESPN before I left this morning. Nothing like a sixth sense, but I felt something tickle the back of my brain. I glanced back toward the kitchen where Jenny was engrossed in her cooking, her expression just a little too focused. Small details, but sometimes those are the loudest. Maybe it was nothing. It could just as easily be me overthinking things. But there was something different, some subtle shift in her demeanor. Married long enough, you notice these things. I didn't feel like calling it out directly. There's a type of tone in a marriage that you don't use unless you want to open up a whole new can of worms. It was tempting to brush it off. My job was about strategies, not detective work. But a thought struck me. Time was a luxury I didn't have. In 2 days, I'd be on a plane to Houston for a conference. And if something was going on, I didn't want to wait until I got back to find out. This was the kind of suspicion that nagged, lingered, and eventually set up a permanent corner office in your head if you let it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not the paranoid type. But you spend enough time building a life with someone, you tend to notice when a piece of the puzzle suddenly looks like it doesn't fit. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jenny was keeping something from me. By the end of that evening, I'd already made up my mind. If there was one thing I'd learned in business, it was that some problems are better outsourced. The next morning, I woke up before Jenny. She was curled up on her side, her hair fanned out over the pillow, looking as innocent as you please. Just watching her, you'd never guess there might be something off. I took a deep breath, let it out slow. Maybe I was imagining things. After all, people turn to sports channels all the time by accident, right? And that taxi could have been innocent. But I'd learned to trust my instincts, especially after seeing enough office backstabbings to know that if you feel something, you investigate. And I'd also learned to delegate. Which is why, around lunchtime, I made a call. Paul's Investigations, a gruff voice answered. Perfect. Yeah, I'd like to hire you to look into something, I said, getting right to the point. By 2 p.m., I was sitting in Paul's modest office, watching him flip through a leather-bound notebook with fingers the size of sausages. Paul looked like the kind of guy who had one friend and preferred it that way. He was in his mid-50s, ex-cop, with a salt and pepper mustache that he probably hadn't trimmed since the Clinton administration. "So let's go over this one more time," he said, pulling out a fresh page. "My wife, Jenny. She works from home, usually alone. Yesterday I came home early and saw a taxi leaving the driveway. She said it was probably just turning around, but then I found the TV on the sports channel. Thing is, I don't watch sports channels at home. I don't even have a reason to." He nodded, scratching something down. "So you think she's having an affair?" "I don't know. Could be nothing. But I'm flying out to a conference tomorrow and don't have time to look into it myself." Paul gave a small, understanding nod, though the glint in his eye said he'd heard the story 100 times. "I'll set up some surveillance. We'll get you an answer one way or another." It was supposed to be a simple, discreet job. Get some clarity, maybe put my mind at ease, go on with life. I told myself it was just a precaution, a way to calm the lingering doubt gnawing at me. But as I drove home from Paul's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was opening a door I might regret walking through. You'd think I'd feel guilty or paranoid for hiring a guy to spy on my wife, but in truth, I felt almost numb, like I was on autopilot. It's funny, people always say you'll feel angry or betrayed in situations like this, but all I felt was a grim resolve. Like I was just waiting to confirm what I already knew. When I got home, Jenny greeted me with her usual smile, a plate of lasagna on the counter. She was in her domestic mode, wearing an apron with her hair tied back, looking the picture of a supportive wife. The nagging doubt I'd carried in from work faded just a bit. "How was your day?" she asked, setting the lasagna in front of me with a gentle smile. "Oh, you know," I replied, cutting a bite of pasta. "Just gearing up for the conference." She nodded, seeming distracted, which might have been normal for anyone else, but not Jenny. She was usually laser-focused on every detail of our conversations. I noticed she kept glancing down at her phone, like she was waiting for a message. The pieces were starting to add up. The next morning, I was on a plane to Houston. As I settled into my seat, I checked my email to see if Paul had sent any updates. Nothing yet, of course. The guy had barely had 24 hours. I did my best to focus on work during the conference, but my mind kept drifting back to Jenny. Every time my phone buzzed, I'd half expect it to be from Paul, delivering some life-altering truth. Finally, that evening, my phone buzzed while I was grabbing a drink at the hotel bar. It was Paul. "Got something for you," his text read. "You might want to sit down." I took a deep breath, finished my drink, and stepped outside to call him back. The night air was cool, with a low hum of traffic in the background. "What did you find?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Well, your wife's been meeting with a guy," he said, sounding almost bored, like he was reading a grocery list. "Middle-aged, gray hair. They meet up during the day, and he's always arriving by taxi. I ran the plates, and it's owned by a corporate account. Your wife's boss, to be exact." "Her boss?" I said, not sure whether to laugh or start planning a manhunt. "Yep. And they aren't just having business lunches, if you catch my drift. I've got photos if you want to see them." I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was in some second-rate soap opera. Jenny, my Jenny, sneaking around with her boss. The whole thing seemed absurd. Here I was, in a job that's been a slog for years, working overtime to get us a nice house, a comfortable life, and she's busy networking on her own terms. After a moment, I cleared my throat. "How bad are we talking?" Paul hesitated, the way people do when they're gauging if you can handle what they're about to say. "Bad enough. Let's just say there's enough evidence here to keep a divorce lawyer busy for months." I swallowed, feeling the burn of anger starting to take root. How long has this been going on? At least 5 months. I'm still piecing it together, but it seems like they meet up at least once a week. The guy's a careful one though, always in a taxi, no car parked at your place to tip anyone off. Of course, that didn't stop Jenny from giving me other tips, like a sports channel he accidentally left on, or that smug little laugh when she tried brushing off my question about the taxi. If she was trying to play it subtle, she was doing a lousy job. Anything else? I asked, wanting to get all the dirt in one go. Paul sighed. I could give you the whole rundown, but it's mostly what you'd expect. Hotels, his office after hours, a little too cozy in the back of cabs. You get the idea. It took me a moment to respond. Send everything you've got. Photos, locations, timestamps. You got it, he replied. I'll send you a full report tonight. If you need a recommendation for a lawyer, I know a few good ones. I let out a humorless laugh. Oh, I'll definitely need one. But not yet. Fair enough, Paul said. I'll be in touch. I hung up, staring out at the Houston skyline. 5 months. My faithful wife had been at this for 5 months, and I hadn't had the faintest clue until now. I could have kicked myself for not seeing it sooner, but there's nothing like cold, hard evidence to rip the blinders off. As I made my way back into the hotel, my mind was already racing through a dozen scenarios of what I'd do with this information. The first plan that came to mind was simple, effective, and about as cold-blooded as it gets. Jenny's birthday was just around the corner, and a perfect opportunity to make her little affair public. If she wanted to start her life with her boss, I'd be only too happy to light the fireworks. I spent the rest of that night reviewing Paul's report. It came in a neat PDF file with enough damning evidence to torpedo any relationship. There were high-resolution photos of Jenny and her boss, Greg Maddox, in cozy scenes that had nothing to do with work. A selfie in the back of a taxi, holding hands. Sneaking a kiss going to the elevator. And then, of course, the clincher, a sequence of photos from a hotel lobby, followed by shots of them heading up to a room on the 4th floor, looking like they couldn't wait to shut the door behind them. If I were a different man, I might have gone numb, but instead, I felt a strange clarity. The anger wasn't boiling over. It was more like a simmer, methodical, purposeful. And the further I scrolled through the evidence, the more a plan began to take shape. I texted Paul again the next morning, just to confirm a few details. When exactly did they start meeting up? Paul, the first encounter I have dates back 5 months, but my guess is they were involved before that. Why? Just checking. I need all the exact dates. I already had an idea forming in the back of my mind, and each confirmed date of their little rendezvous added fuel to the fire. Jenny's birthday was coming up in a week, a Saturday no less. She'd already mentioned wanting a party, inviting family, friends, a few colleagues. The boss would surely be there. Perfect. I'd set the scene and give them both a gift they'd never forget. For the next few days, I kept up appearances. Morning coffee, polite chats about her busy work schedule, as if I didn't know she'd been slipping off to meet Greg. She was as chipper as ever, breezing through our conversations without the slightest hint of guilt. It's incredible what people can hide under a smile and a bit of small talk. But behind that facade, I was orchestrating my revenge. First, I lined up meetings with a lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Martha who knew her way around messy divorces. I wanted to be ready, especially if Jenny thought she'd get away with anything when this all went public. Then, I called my bank and our financial advisor to discuss moving a few things around. All these years of marriage, and I'd been the sole breadwinner, the one who'd kept our finances running smoothly. Jenny had access to plenty, but the bulk of the savings was safely in my name. I'd quietly make some transfers before the big day, just to be sure she wouldn't suddenly develop any creative ideas. As the day approached, Jenny was all smiles, chattering about her party and whom she wanted to invite. She wanted it to be classy but fun, with family, friends, even some of her work people. She didn't know that I'd already made a couple of calls, suggesting that her guest list include Greg, her so-called mentor. I guess she figured I was oblivious enough to have no idea who Greg really was to her. Which, as it turned out, would be her fatal mistake. I kept it cool the entire week, even throwing in some extra charm. I noticed she seemed surprised when I offered to help organize some of the party logistics. I'd get the caterers, arrange the rentals, handle the setup, everything she wanted. She might have thought I was being thoughtful, and for once, she'd be right. Just not in the way she imagined. By the night before her birthday, everything was in place. My lawyer had reviewed the paperwork, my assets were secure, and the some peoples had their instructions. The next morning, I woke up feeling an odd kind of calm. Jenny was running around, excited as ever, checking last-minute details. She barely registered my presence as she fussed with decorations and called her friends to confirm their arrival times. Every once in a while, she'd flash me a big smile, probably thinking about the party and whatever sentimental gift she imagined I'd gotten her. The guests started arriving around 5 o'clock, bringing the usual assortment of cheap wine, overly enthusiastic hugs, and small talk that could lull a narcoleptic. Jenny's parents were there, beaming with pride over their daughter's accomplishments, whatever those might have been. A few of my friends came too, invited out of courtesy, though they had no idea what was really going on. And of course, Jenny's work crew showed up, including her dear mentor Greg, who swaggered in with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. I shook his hand with a polite smile, resisting the urge to ask him how he enjoyed our marital bed. He gave me a bland grin, clearly believing he'd gotten away with his little scheme. I glanced over at Jenny, who was talking to her friends with that practiced, oblivious ease, looking every bit the loyal wife. I almost admired her dedication to the part. The room filled up quickly, and soon enough, people were clinking glasses and toasting Jenny's special day. I watched her bask in the glow of their attention, smiling at each gift, thanking everyone with that syrupy sincerity she did so well. If I didn't know better, I might have believed it myself. As the evening wore on, I kept an eye on the clock, counting down to the main event. At precisely 8 o'clock, I gave the nod to the caterer, and a minute later, a courier entered the room with 2 neatly wrapped packages. I stepped forward, drawing a few curious glances, and tapped a fork against my glass. "All right, everyone," I said, raising my voice just enough to get their attention. "It's time for a very special gift. Jenny, I wanted to make sure you'd remember this birthday forever." She gave me a confused smile, clearly unsure what I was up to, while Greg shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the packages in the courier's hands. The waiter brought out the cake I'd ordered, a modest little thing with 5 tall candles. I set it down in front of her, letting the silence stretch as I stared her down, making sure she didn't miss the glint in my eye. She looked confused, blinking her eyes, and not understanding what the cake with 5 candles was for. "5 candles," I said slowly, watching her face carefully. "One for each month of betrayal." Her smile faltered, confusion turning to dawning horror as the meaning hit her. She glanced around, eyes darting to the faces of her friends and family, all staring at her in surprise. I nodded toward the courier, who handed one package to Jenny and the other to Greg's unsuspecting wife Linda. "Open them," I said, barely hiding the satisfaction in my voice. Jenny's face had gone from shock to sheer panic. Her hand shook as she tore open the package, revealing a thick folder filled with photos, texts, and everything she'd need to understand just how much I knew. Greg was staring down at the evidence, frozen like a deer in headlights. His wife Linda had already opened her folder, and her expression turned stony as she took in the explicit photos of her husband and Jenny. Jenny's friends stood there, wide-eyed, exchanging horrified glances. Her parents' faces drained of color as they realized what was going on. The room, once filled with laughter, had fallen into a stunned silence. And there it was, my masterpiece. My little tableau of betrayal, deceit, and public shaming, laid out for everyone to see. For a moment, the room hung in silence, a surreal calm settling over the crowd. Jenny sat frozen, clutching the damning evidence in her hands, her knuckles turning white. Greg looked like he'd swallowed a lemon, his gaze darting around the room, desperate for some way out. Meanwhile, his wife Linda held her own package, looking at him with an expression that would make most men shrivel. She clearly hadn't seen this coming, either. I had to admit, for someone who ran a department, Greg was woefully unprepared for anything resembling accountability. Jenny's mother, sitting nearby, leaned in, her face twisted in horror as she finally glimpsed what her daughter held. "Jenny, what is this?" she whispered, her voice sharp and almost accusatory. Her father, normally a man who kept his nose firmly out of other people's business, was staring at Jenny like she'd just confessed to a felony. I gave them all a little shrug, feigning a kind of sad resignation. "I thought it was time to give everyone the full picture," I said, my voice carrying just the right mix of concerned husband and man taking out the trash. I turned to Jenny, adding in a softer tone, "After all, you wanted everyone close to you here." I figured honesty was the best policy. Jenny, still rooted to her chair, looked up, her face drained of color. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. This was a woman who had spent her career crafting messages, spinning truths to suit her agenda. And yet here she was, in front of family, friends, colleagues, silent. "Jake, please," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please what?" I replied, crossing my arms. "Please ignore the fact that you've been cheating on me for 5 months with your boss? Or maybe you'd prefer I overlook the fact that you didn't even have the decency to end it before bringing him into my home." Her friends looked at each other, stunned and uncomfortable, the kind of people who didn't have a clue what to say. Some tried to avert their eyes, while others glanced at Jenny with a mix of pity and disgust. I couldn't help but notice the subtle way people shifted away from her, like betrayal might be catching. It was funny, really. People talk about loyalty and friendship, but when the truth comes out, everyone's quick to sidestep the wreckage. I never meant for it to go this far," she stammered, her eyes glassy. "Oh no? You never meant for it to go this far?" I repeated, letting the sarcasm drip. "Tell me which part of it going too far was confusing. The hotel rooms? The lunchtime meetings? The cab rides to keep it all quiet?" I leaned in, my voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You know, for someone who claims to love honesty, you sure put a lot of effort into hiding this." I turned my attention to Greg, who looked like he was sweating buckets. The guy had that particular brand of arrogance worn by men who think they're invincible, who believe that a wife will just look the other way. He was about to learn otherwise. "Greg," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet drawl, "I believe Linda has a few questions for you." He flinched at his own wife's name, casting a nervous glance in her direction. Linda hadn't said a word, but her silence spoke volumes. The sharp glare she directed at him would have cut glass, and it was clear she was re-evaluating every moment of their marriage. I gestured to the cake that was still sitting in front of Jenny, 5 candles burning like the embers of our relationship, each one representing a month of lies and deception. "You know, I didn't actually get you anything else, Jenny. I thought this," I gestured to the evidence pile, "was personal enough." The air was heavy with tension, the kind that usually follows an explosion. No one in the room seemed capable of movement, least of all Jenny, who was staring down at the candles as if they might give her the answers. But there weren't any answers left, just the uncomfortable raw truth, laid bare for everyone to see. Finally, Jenny's father cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Jake, maybe we should step outside." I raised an eyebrow, letting the moment hang. He was trying to smooth things over, make it look like this could be dealt with privately, as if we hadn't already crossed a line no one could uncross. But I shook my head, giving him a look that I hoped would convey the absolute certainty I had in what I was doing. "No, Tom," I said calmly. "I think everyone here deserves to know exactly who they've been dealing with. I'm tired of secrets. Besides, I've already taken care of everything." I pulled out a key from my pocket and tossed it onto the table, where it clattered next to Jenny's untouched slice of cake. "Here's the key to a storage unit where you'll find all your stuff, Jenny. While we were here celebrating, I made sure the locks on the house were changed and all your things were taken out. Your things will be stored until the end of the week. You might want to make other arrangements. I doubt your parents are feeling very welcoming right now." Jenny's mother let out a strangled sound, half gasp, half sob, her face buried in her hands. Jenny, still in shock, looked between me and her parents, as if hoping someone would intervene. But no one did. "Don't waste your time with apologies," I added, glancing at her. "Save them for someone who hasn't seen all the ways you played them." Jenny's hands clenched around the edge of her chair, her face twisted in a desperate plea. "Jake, please. I don't know what to say." I shrugged, my voice hardening. "Then don't say anything. For once, let the silence do the talking." Turning to Linda, I gave her a respectful nod. "There's a second copy of the evidence, Linda. Figured you'd want to have it on hand, in case you needed it, for whatever comes next." She looked at me with a thin smile of gratitude, though the bitterness behind it was unmistakable. "Thank you, Jake. I'll be sure to put it to good use." With that, I stepped back, signaling to the caterer, who was all too eager to get out of the tension-heavy room, to clear the cake and drinks. The guests looked at each other in a kind of uncomfortable murmur, glancing toward the exit, all too eager to make their escape. But I wasn't going to end things without a final note, a closing touch to make sure everyone got the message. Oh, and for the record, I added, addressing the room, I've sent a copy of this evidence to the board of directors. Figured they'd like to know how one of their department heads spends his time on the clock. If you're planning on sending out any resumes, Greg, you'd better hurry. Greg went pale, his jaw clenched in a forced silence as he shifted his gaze to the floor. Jenny let out a horrified gasp, no doubt realizing just how completely her world was unraveling in front of her. You can keep the candles, I said with a shrug, nodding toward Jenny and her cake. Consider them a reminder of what's lost. With that, I turned and walked toward the door, leaving the room full of whispers and judgment behind me. I didn't look back, didn't need to. The image of Jenny's face, the shock, the betrayal, the dawning horror, was already etched in my mind. I stepped out into the cool night air, breathing it in like a man finally free. No longer tethered to someone who couldn't understand loyalty, who took everything for granted. I was done, walking away with the certainty that I'd left her with a mess she'd never forget. I walked away from the birthday catastrophe with a sense of relief that almost made me giddy. For once, I didn't feel that dragging weight I'd been carrying for months. The looks of horror, the whispers, the gasps from our so-called friends, it was like a one-night-only show, designed by yours truly. I was pretty sure they'd be talking about this one for a long time. But as satisfying as that performance was, I still had work to do. Real life doesn't end with a dramatic exit. There are documents to sign, accounts to manage, and messes to clean up, the kind that don't get handled with a snappy one-liner. So I walked to my car, slid into my Lincoln, and headed to the only place I knew would help me wrap things up with Jenny, my lawyer's office. The next morning, I found myself in Martha's office, taking a seat across from her desk. Martha, a fierce divorce attorney with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, didn't waste time on small talk. She was flipping through our papers, double-checking the paperwork, as I filled her in on the aftermath of the big birthday reveal. She looked up, a flicker of amusement in her otherwise steely eyes. "Quite the party you threw," she said, smirking as she stapled a few documents together. I'm sure she didn't expect that. I shrugged, leaning back in my chair. Didn't think anyone did. Least of all her. She tapped her pen thoughtfully, and I knew she was already mapping out the best way to tackle the divorce. You've done most of the work for me, so it's really just a matter of dividing the assets. With the evidence you've gathered, alimony isn't likely to be an issue. You're on solid ground, Jake. Glad to hear it, I said, though her confidence wasn't a surprise. After everything I'd uncovered, even Jenny's best attempt at a defense wouldn't hold up. She'd forfeited any right to leniency the moment she decided to bring her boss into our marriage, and I wasn't about to let her walk away with so much as an extra pillow. Over the next few days, Martha and I went through each detail, dismantling the remnants of my marriage like a demolition project. The accounts we'd shared were split, the property papers amended, my assets locked in tighter than Fort Knox. With every signature, I felt like I was wiping away the last traces of Jenny's deceit. There was something satisfying in the precision of it all, in knowing that with each document, I was severing yet another tie. Of course, in a world that loves drama, it didn't take long for the story to make its way around our circle of friends and family. A few people called to check in on me, each pretending they hadn't already heard every juicy detail through the grapevine. I got texts too, with that special brand of pity people love to offer when they're secretly relieved they aren't in your shoes. "Jake, are you okay? Heard about Jenny. Such a shock. What a nightmare. Let me know if you need anything." I ignored most of them, though a few close friends, like Dan, my college buddy, deserved an update. Dan was a realist, like me, a guy who'd been married long enough to understand that no one's immune to betrayal, least of all when they're married to someone like Jenny. "Damn, Jake, that's one for the books," he said on the phone, and I could almost see him shaking his head in disbelief. "Jenny? I mean, she always struck me as intense, but, her boss." "Yep," I replied, my voice as even as I could keep it. 5 months of lunchtime networking sessions with her so-called mentor. I guess ambition took a front seat. Dan let out a dark laugh. "Guess the grass really isn't greener, huh?" "Nope," I replied, smirking to myself. "Just muddier." In truth, the calls and texts were mostly background noise, just like the gossiping of our so-called friends. But then there were the calls from Jenny herself. Starting 2 days after the party, I'd get messages, then voicemails, each one laced with a different flavor of desperation. The first one was a classic Jenny move, rationalizing with that practiced calm that had always worked for her in every situation, but this one. Jake, it's me. Look, I know we need to talk about what happened, okay? I'm sorry. I made a mistake, but we can work this out, can't we? Just call me, please. I deleted that one, then the next, and the next. Every message escalated from remorse to full-blown panic, with apologies that only grew wilder with each day. By day 5, the voicemails had taken a turn toward the poetic, her voice cracking as she pleaded for me to reconsider. But each one only solidified how right I was to leave her behind. Then there was the one that came on day 7, the voice message that might have made me laugh if it hadn't been so absurd. Jenny was in tears, her voice shaky and almost hysterical. Jake, please. I'm begging you. I'll do anything. We can fix this. I'll quit my job, I'll go to counseling, whatever it takes. Don't just throw it all away. We built this life together. Don't leave me like this. I shook my head as I deleted that one too. Funny, she thought it was me who was throwing it all away. I'd merely decided that if she was going to toss our life aside, she could do it without dragging me down with her. The next morning, she showed up at my office. I'd barely settled into my chair when my assistant poked her head in, giving me a sympathetic look. Jake, there's a woman here to see you. Says it's urgent. Her name's Jenny. I sighed, already feeling the headache forming. Thanks, but no thanks. Tell her I'm busy. Actually, she said hesitantly, she's in the lobby. Said she won't leave until she sees you. For a second, I considered just walking out, taking an early lunch and letting her wait there until security ushered her out. But something in me wanted to end this face-to-face. Call it closure, or maybe just a chance to say my piece, but I finally nodded, gesturing for my assistant to show her in. Jenny walked in, looking as though she hadn't slept in days, her eyes red and her face a shade too pale to pass for anything but miserable. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, stopping her before she could start her monologue. Why are you here, Jenny? She fidgeted, clasping her hands together in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. Jake, please. I know I messed up, but I can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. I can't lose you. I met her gaze, unmoved. You already did. She blinked, the reality settling in. I could see her trying to summon the charm that had always gotten her what she wanted, but it was gone, as empty as her words. She opened her mouth again, searching for something to say, but I didn't give her the chance. Jenny, we're done, I said, my tone cold, matter of fact. We were done the moment you decided your boss was worth more than what we had. You don't come back from that. Jake, I was stupid, she said, tears glistening in her eyes. It didn't mean anything. I love you. I laughed, a short, humorless chuckle that probably surprised her more than it surprised me. Love? Is that what you call it? Sneaking around with your boss, lying to my face? Whatever you call that, it's not love. And if it is, it's not the kind I need. She flinched, a tear spilling over, but I was done caring. This was the end, the final nail in the coffin, and I wanted her to feel it. I suggest you take the time you've got left to pack up the rest of your things from storage, I said, the finality in my tone clear. And after that, I suggest you start figuring out where you're going to go. Because there's no place for you here. She stared at me, stunned, as if finally realizing the weight of her choices. Without another word, she turned and left, her footsteps fading down the hallway. As she left, I felt the faintest twinge of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was regret, or pity. But as soon as the door closed behind her, I felt it wash away. After Jenny left my office that day, I thought I'd seen the last of her. But if there's one thing betrayal teaches you, it's that people rarely leave cleanly. Sure enough, the next few days brought another wave of texts and emails from her, all sounding like the desperate Hail Mary attempts of someone who's finally run out of options. Her messages shifted from apology to anger, and finally bargaining, as though offering half-hearted penance would somehow erase the past 5 months. But each new attempt just confirmed how out of touch she was with reality. She didn't understand that when you torch something down to the foundation, there's no unburning it. Then, of course, there was Greg, the other half of this sordid mess. His fallout began trickling in shortly after the birthday fiasco, though I hadn't planned to waste much mental energy on him. His wife, Linda, had gone as silent as a stone after our special delivery, which for a woman like her, was as much a death sentence as anything I could have planned. On the professional front, the board of directors at their company wasted no time, particularly once they got a copy of my little evidence package. Word from mutual acquaintances hinted that the board wasn't taking kindly to their executive in a compromising position, especially one he'd managed to turn into an HR nightmare. In less than a week, Greg went from department head to department deadweight, and I had to assume his resume was getting dusted off, assuming Linda hadn't already shredded it in a fit of rage. In a twisted sense, I had to hand it to Jenny. She really knew how to pick a winner. Here was a guy who risked his job, his marriage, and his reputation for an affair that would ultimately cost him everything. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. A few days later, I got a call from Linda herself. I'd honestly wondered if I'd hear from her again, since she'd been radio silent since the party. But her voice was calm, controlled, and bitter as coffee left on a burner too long. "Jake," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "I wanted to thank you for the information." I could practically feel the resentment simmering through the phone. She'd built a life with Greg, just as I had with Jenny, only to find herself on the receiving end of one gut punch after another. If anyone could understand where I was coming from, it was Linda. "Figured you'd appreciate it," I replied evenly. "Everyone deserves the truth." She let out a humorless laugh. "The truth," she repeated. "Right. Well, now I have it. And so does the board. Greg's on unpaid leave until they investigate." I chuckled softly. "I imagine that's a short investigation." "Oh, you have no idea," she replied, her tone acid-sharp. "They're furious. It turns out, Greg didn't just cost himself his job, he's lost them some pretty important clients with all this. Apparently, his mentorship extended to long lunches that left the real work for everyone else." I let out a low whistle, feigning sympathy. Guess his priorities were elsewhere. Clearly. She paused, her voice lowering. "Anyway, just wanted you to know that he's paying for it. In every way he can." It was the kind of reassurance I didn't need, but appreciated anyway. She gave a curt goodbye, hanging up with a satisfying finality, leaving me alone in the quiet satisfaction that justice, if you can call it that, was marching on without me lifting another finger. The next day, I received another message from Jenny, which might have been the funniest yet. It was an email this time, with the subject line, "For old time's sake." I clicked it, already bracing myself for the absurdity that awaited, and sure enough, Jenny didn't disappoint. In her message, she asked, no pleaded, for me to reconsider the divorce. She threw in everything she could think of, our shared history, our deep connection, and even that worn-out line about all the good times we'd had. As if good memories could erase months of lying, sneaking around, and blatant disrespect. But the best part, the crowning jewel of her plea, was this gem of a line. "I know I made mistakes, but deep down we both know that we belong together." I laughed so hard that my assistant actually poked her head in to check on me. I waved her off, shaking my head as I read the email again, marveling at the sheer delusion it must have taken to believe that we could go back to any semblance of normalcy. I clicked reply and typed out a simple response. "Jenny, deep down isn't enough to build a marriage on. You should have considered our connection before you tossed it aside. Best of luck." Then I hit send and watched it disappear into the digital ether, feeling a profound sense of closure. With that, I was done responding. Done engaging. Done. The days passed quietly after that, and I spent most of my time tying up the last few loose ends with Martha, finalizing the divorce paperwork. On my way out of her office one afternoon, I ran into Dan, who had texted me earlier about catching up over a drink. He took one look at me and whistled, a grin breaking out on his face. "Well, look at you, Jake," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You look like a man who just found his way out of the jungle." "Feels like it too," I admitted, chuckling. "It's amazing how much air there is to breathe once you're out of that mess." We headed to a nearby bar, the kind with enough ambient noise to let conversations drift freely, and ordered a couple of bourbons. Dan raised his glass, a glint of admiration in his eye. To freedom, he said, clinking his glass against mine. To freedom, I echoed, taking a long sip. We caught up, mostly about my new plans, his wife and kids, and the job. But eventually, as conversations do, it circled back to Jenny. You think she's going to make it through all this? He asked, genuinely curious. I shrugged. That's up to her. She made her bed. If she's smart, she'll lie in it. I'm not holding my breath. Dan shook his head, marveling. Never thought she'd turn out like this. But then again, people surprise you, don't they? More than you'd think, I replied, smirking. But I'm done being surprised. We laughed, toasting to that as we finished our drinks, the last hint of bitterness washing away with the bourbon. I was still marveling at the change in me, at the weight that had lifted. There's nothing like betrayal to crack you open, to force you to look at things from a colder, clearer angle. When I got home that evening, I poured myself a drink and sat back, letting the quiet settle around me. I thought about Jenny, about all the calls and texts I'd ignored, the lies and pleas she'd tried to spin. There was a time when I'd have forgiven her. A younger, less cynical version of me might have considered trying to fix things, to patch up what was broken. But now, all I felt was relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief. The next morning, I checked my email and saw an automated message from my lawyer's office. Divorce finalized. All documents processed. Just like that, it was over. The email confirming the divorce felt like the final stroke of a pen across my old life. No more Jenny, no more shared assets, no more explanations. Just a clear, neat line drawn between the past and the present. I'd wondered for years what the end of this marriage would feel like, but I'd never imagined that it would leave me feeling lighter, free, even. But as satisfying as it was to be untangled from Jenny, the reality was, I still had a few emotional knots to work through. There's a kind of inventory you take when everything you thought you knew is turned upside down. I found myself asking, how had I missed the signs? Had I been too trusting? Too focused on work to see my own wife slipping away? I spent the next few days in a mix of business as usual and low-level introspection. I'd never been one for therapy, but I'll admit, I did a bit of amateur psychoanalysis over a glass of bourbon each night. There's something therapeutic about staring at a dark glass of whiskey, letting your thoughts drift while you ask yourself some of life's less comfortable questions. One evening, Dan called. He had his own theories about my self-reflection phase, suggesting that I was better off just forgetting it all. Move forward, Jake. Dwelling on the past is like driving with one eye in the rearview mirror, he told me. But it wasn't that simple. There was something I needed to process, even if it wasn't about Jenny herself, but the whole idea of trust and what it meant in my life now. So, in typical Jake fashion, I made a list. You could say I was compartmentalizing, but this list wasn't about what went wrong. It was more like guidelines for what would come next. First on the list was trust. After the betrayal I just lived through, trust was now something you earned, not something I handed out freely. Next was honesty, and I mean brutal honesty. If I was going to let anyone back into my life, they'd have to know exactly where they stood. With each item I jotted down, I felt a little closer to a future where I wouldn't make the same mistakes again. And that night, for the first time in months, I went to bed without 1,000 questions buzzing in my head. Just a satisfying kind of quiet, like the calm after a storm. The next day, I took a small step forward and removed Jenny's last traces from my life. I packed up the few odds and ends she'd left behind at the storage unit, dropped them off at a thrift store, and closed out the account. It felt oddly like purging a house of ghosts, letting go of the past in the most tangible way possible. But then, right as I was starting to feel steady, the world decided it wasn't quite finished with me yet. As I was about to leave work one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Hey Jake. It's Linda. Linda, Greg's now ex-wife, who I hadn't spoken to since her curt, post-party call where she'd thanked me for the information. I wasn't sure what to make of this sudden contact, but curiosity got the better of me, and I replied. Hi Linda. Didn't expect to hear from you. Her response was quick. I wanted to meet for coffee. Just to talk. I feel like we're both due for some closure. I thought about it for a moment. Linda and I had shared a unique, if unfortunate, experience. We'd been blindsided, betrayed, left to pick up the pieces while our exes moved on. In some ways, she might have been the only person who could really understand the strange blend of betrayal and relief I was feeling. So, after a moment's hesitation, I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe the following day, the kind of place where no one cares about who you are or what you're talking about as long as you don't get too loud. Linda looked as put together as always, her expression giving nothing away. She had that polished look of someone who'd been through hell and come out with her lipstick and eyeliner perfectly intact. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I wasn't sure if you'd be open to it." I shrugged, offering a small smile. We've both had an interesting few weeks. Figured a little debrief couldn't hurt. She smiled back, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. True enough. She paused, glancing down at her coffee, and took a deep breath. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry. I don't know why, but I feel like part of this mess is my fault." That took me by surprise. "Your fault? Linda, your husband was sneaking around behind your back just as much as Jenny was behind mine. None of that's on you." She gave a rueful chuckle. "Rationally, I know that. But still. Greg's always been a charmer, you know? I ignored the signs, let him convince me he was loyal. He said all the right things. And I let him." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It was a strange kind of guilt, a misplaced sense of responsibility, as if by trusting them we'd somehow become accomplices in our own betrayal. "Funny," I said, "I've been having the same thoughts. Guess we were both good at believing lies." She nodded, her gaze softening. "But maybe that's not a bad thing, Jake. Maybe it means we're capable of trust, which is more than they could ever say." I hadn't thought of it that way, but maybe she was right. We'd put our faith in people who ultimately didn't deserve it, but that wasn't a flaw in us. It was a flaw in them. Sitting there, I realized that maybe this whole ordeal hadn't destroyed my ability to trust, only my ability to trust blindly. We talked for a while longer, comparing notes on the aftermath of the party and the way each of our exes had reacted. Linda shared that Greg had been officially fired, with a full review of his professional conduct on his record, which meant that his job prospects were dim, to say the least. It was a strange comfort, knowing that his consequences were real, just as Jenny's were. As we finished up our coffee, Linda gave me a small smile. "Well, Jake, I think we've dissected this mess enough for one day." "Agreed," I replied, feeling a weight lifting even as we stood to leave. She extended her hand, and I shook it, feeling a small sense of camaraderie. "Take care of yourself, Jake. Here's to better chapters ahead." "You too, Linda. We've earned them." With that, we went our separate ways. There was a kind of peace that came with it, a shared understanding that while we might never fully erase the scars, we'd learned something valuable, something that would help us walk into the future with our eyes open and our expectations grounded. That night, I went home, poured myself a drink, and looked out at the quiet street from my living room. My life was mine again, unburdened by the lies, the guilt, the relentless attempts to fix something that had been broken for longer than I'd cared to admit. I wasn't angry anymore, wasn't sad either. What was left was a simple acceptance, a clean slate with no strings attached. For the first time, I felt something that had eluded me for a long time. I felt free. The realization that I was finally free didn't come as some grand epiphany. It was quieter, more like a low hum, a persistent sense of calm that settled in the days following my coffee with Linda. Life resumed in a new, uncomplicated rhythm. Each day, I went to work, finished projects, and returned home to a space that was now fully my own. There were no calls from Jenny, no frantic texts or desperate emails. She'd finally accepted reality, it seemed, or maybe she was too caught up in her own mess to bother me further. The solitude didn't bother me, not anymore. I'd always enjoyed having time to myself, and now that time felt richer, like it had weight and meaning again. Even the smallest things, an extra cup of coffee in the morning, a walk after work, felt intentional. I'd started reading again, picking up novels I'd abandoned years ago, letting myself get lost in someone else's world for a change. One afternoon, Dan called and suggested I join him and a few friends for a drink. It had been a while since I'd been out socially, and while the thought of navigating the inevitable questions made me hesitate, I figured it was time. So that Friday, I headed to a bar I hadn't visited in months, finding Dan and a few others waiting at a corner table. "Jake," Dan called out, clapping me on the back as I arrived. "Thought you'd gone into witness protection." I laughed, shrugging. "Maybe I did. But I'm back now." The rest of the group cheered me on, and soon enough we were catching up like old times. They were tactful enough to avoid mentioning Jenny, though a few exchanged knowing glances. I let them have their silent curiosities, choosing instead to focus on the conversation, the easy banter, and the warmth of being back in the familiar rhythm of friendship. But it wasn't long before one of the guys, Matt, couldn't hold his curiosity any longer. He leaned in with a wry grin. "All right, Jake," he said, keeping his tone light. "So what's next for you? You know, now that you're unshackled." Dan shot him a look, but I just chuckled, raising my glass. "Next? Well, let's just say I'm not in a rush to do anything drastic. I'm enjoying the quiet for now." Matt nodded, but there was that hint of expectation in his eyes, like he was waiting for more. I gave him a shrug, keeping it simple. You know, it's nice to just be. No chaos, no mess. Just time to figure things out, one step at a time. That seemed to satisfy him, and the conversation moved on. As the night wore on, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't just surviving, I was living, reclaiming each piece of my life, bit by bit. And for the first time, I could see the future without dreading it. The next few weeks flew by. I found myself taking on new projects at work, the kind I'd normally avoid because they required extra hours or creative risk. But with nothing holding me back, I actually enjoyed pushing myself, feeling like I was tapping into something I'd forgotten I had. There was a freedom in throwing myself into work, knowing I didn't have to worry about anyone's schedule or needs but my own. But life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. One Saturday morning, as I was browsing the farmer's market near my apartment, I noticed someone familiar out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought I was mistaken, but as I turned, I saw Linda, inspecting a display of tomatoes with a look of serious concentration. I debated whether to say anything, but she glanced up and caught my eye, giving me a warm smile and a wave. "Jake," she said, joining me near the coffee stand. "Small world, huh?" "Looks that way," I replied, grinning. "How's everything?" She shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "Better. Different, but better." We grabbed coffee and wandered through the market, catching up on everything we hadn't covered during our last conversation. She was adjusting to her own newfound independence, navigating life post-Greg, and had taken up a few hobbies she'd always put off: painting, traveling, trying out new recipes. We laughed at the irony of how both of us had found freedom through endings we hadn't chosen. After a while, we found ourselves at a quiet corner table in a nearby cafe, lingering over coffee that had gone cold. "So what now?" she asked, her gaze searching. "For you, I mean. You mentioned wanting peace and quiet, but do you ever think about what comes after that?" I paused, letting her question sink in. I'd been so focused on piecing myself back together that I hadn't given much thought to what came next. But sitting there, watching Linda's curious gaze, I felt a strange flicker of possibility. "Honestly? I'm not sure," I admitted, laughing softly. "But for once, I don't mind not having a plan. I used to think I needed everything mapped out: job, house, marriage. But now, I'm okay with not knowing." She nodded, smiling. "I get that. Turns out, uncertainty has a certain appeal, doesn't it?" "Yeah," I said, nodding. "And I think I'm finally ready for it." We finished our coffee, and as we walked back to the market, I realized that maybe, just maybe, life had more in store for me than I'd given it credit for. Linda and I exchanged numbers, promising to catch up again soon, though neither of us pushed for anything more. I wasn't looking to rush into anything, and from what I could tell, neither was she. But there was a comfort in knowing that life had a funny way of working out. The weeks passed, and with each one, I felt stronger, more sure of myself. I found myself open to new ideas, things I'd brushed aside before. I took up an art class, went on a solo hiking trip, even signed up for a cooking course that made me look twice at the list of ingredients. Life was full, and for once, it felt like it was all mine. Eventually, Linda and I met up again, and over time, our friendship grew, gradually becoming something deeper, something we were both careful with. There was no rush, no need to define it or put it in a box. We were two people who'd been through the fire and come out the other side, and that was enough. Whatever it became, I knew I'd be fine. One evening, months later, as we sat on a park bench watching the sunset, she turned to me with that familiar, thoughtful look. "Do you ever regret it, Jake?" she asked. "Not trying to fix things with Jenny?" I thought about it, really thought about it. And the answer came as naturally as breathing. "No," I said, looking out at the sky. "Not anymore. Sometimes you have to let things break, to really see what they were made of. And sometimes, breaking is the best thing that can happen." She nodded, smiling softly, understanding without needing any more explanation. And in that quiet moment, I realized just how far I'd come, and how ready I was to leave the past behind. So, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I reached out, took her hand, and felt that steady, calm certainty that only comes when you've walked through fire, and come out whole on the other side.